By the time the sun slipped below the jagged peaks, you knew the cold was coming. It wasn't just a winter night. It was the beginning of something far harsher, a stretch of bone-chilling nights where survival would be decided by the simplest of things. A trench, some snow, and a fire. Before we set out, let us know where you're listening from, and if the harsh winters of the frontier speak to you, hitch your horse to the channel for tomorrow's story. By the time the sun slipped below the jagged peaks of the Rockies, you knew the cold was coming. It wasn't just a winter night. It was the beginning of something far harsher, a stretch of bone-chilling nights that would decide your fate on the simplest of things. A trench, some snow, and a fire. Nothing more. Samuel Sam Hawk had ridden these mountains for nearly 2 decades, a seasoned cowboy in his mid-30s, shaped by years of harsh winters and unforgiving terrain. Yet this was different. The weather had been turning worse for days, and the mountain pass he'd been crossing suddenly felt like a death trap. The wind howled through the canyon like a wild animal hunting its prey, and the snow came down in thick sheets, relentless and blinding. He could feel it in his bones. The storm was coming for him. It wasn't the sort of thing that sneaks up on you. You could feel it on your skin, in the brittle air, in the heavy weight of the sky pressing down. The horizon seemed to shrink with every passing minute. A cowboy's life on the frontier wasn't an easy one, but it was a life Sam knew. He was accustomed to long days, sleeping beneath the stars, fighting hunger and thirst, weathering storms that would have broken lesser men. But something about this storm gnawed at his gut, and when he looked out over the wind-blasted slope, he knew the simple shelters he'd known in the past, crude lean-tos and tarps stretched across trees, wouldn't keep him safe this time, not against what was coming. As the sun sank lower, Sam made the decision. He wouldn't ride through it. There would be no town to ride into, no friendly faces to greet him, no saloon to find warmth. This storm was not like any other. The wind picked up, and the snow began to swirl in violent gusts, thickening into a blinding whiteout. Sam gripped the reins tightly, his hands already feeling the chill, and he steered his horse to a small, sheltered nook he had spotted earlier, a patch of land slightly protected by the jagged ridges around it. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. His horse snorted as he dismounted, the snow crunching beneath his boots. Sam's fingers were numb as he tried to tie the reins to a nearby tree, his mind already calculating the few resources he had. There were no barns here, no cabin to retreat to, just the wilderness and the wild wind. But it wasn't the first time he'd been forced to make do with little. He surveyed his surroundings. The wind was rising. The snow came down in layers, swirling in deadly gusts that threatened to blind him. The trees around him, half buried under snow, provided little shelter. He had no time to waste. The only way he was going to survive this was to create a shelter, and fast. As the snow continued to fall, Sam's thoughts raced. The wind had picked up, howling through the mountains with an intensity he hadn't experienced in years. It was no longer just about survival. It was about staying alive long enough for the storm to pass. He had learned long ago that the wilderness didn't care about your plans or how many times you'd survived before. The mountains gave no quarter. Sam pulled his coat tighter around himself, the chill creeping through his layers. His horse was huddled beneath a sparse tree, its breath coming out in heavy puffs of steam. He glanced at the animal. It wouldn't be long before the cold started to affect it too. It had been a long journey, and now, stuck in this snowstorm, he had to think fast. He looked around, sizing up the small patch of shelter he had found. The snow was already piling up, covering the landscape in a white, suffocating blanket. In the distance, he could barely see the outlines of the jagged peaks, their sharp ridges now softened by the storm. The darkness was setting in faster than he anticipated, and the temperature was dropping, faster than he could have imagined. His eyes narrowed. He had to act quickly. Sam knew the old-timers' stories about surviving storms like this. They spoke of snow trenches, of digging into the snow to create a space that could protect a man from the worst of the cold. He'd always thought it was a bit excessive, unnecessary after all. He was a cowboy, used to living rough, not a mountain man. But looking at the storm that was quickly blanketing the mountainside, Sam realized that the trench wasn't just a story. It was a tool, a necessity. He dropped to his knees, feeling the snow bite into his pants as he sank into the white powder. Sam had never dug a trench before, but he didn't need to know much more than how to dig and how to use his hands. He swung his shovel into the snow, cutting into the powder with practiced precision. The ground beneath him was soft enough to carve through, but as he dug deeper, he could feel the bite of the wind cutting through his clothing, numbing his hands. The trench began to take shape, an irregular line through the snow, wide enough for him to crawl into. Sam worked quickly, using everything he had to dig down and make enough space for him to lie flat. The snow was cold and heavy, each shovelful a reminder of how hard it was going to be to survive the night. But he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Once he had dug deep enough, he began to think about how he could make the space warmer. A shelter wasn't much good if it didn't keep the cold out. He had no materials for building a traditional shelter, no logs, no tools beyond his shovel, and the knife at his side. But he did have snow. Snow was the key, a natural insulator, perfect for blocking the wind. Sam began to shape the walls of the trench, piling snow around the edges, creating a barrier that would protect him from the full force of the storm. By the time Sam had finished digging the trench, the storm had intensified. The wind whipped around him like a living thing, howling through the canyon and pressing against the snow walls he'd hastily constructed. The trench wasn't much, just a simple hole in the snow, barely big enough for him to curl into. But it was something. It was better than nothing, and for now, that would have to be enough. The cold bit through his gloves as he worked, but Sam pushed through. He gathered up a few small logs from the trees around him, stacking them carefully inside the trench. It wasn't much, but at least he had something to keep the fire contained. The snow outside was already deep enough to be a concern, and he needed to keep his fire alive. The next task was to get a fire started. He had a small bundle of kindling in his pack, though it wasn't much. Sam didn't carry much beyond the essentials: his rifle, a knife, some tools, and a few odds and ends for making camp. Firewood was always the first thing to run out, especially in these storms, but he was lucky. The ground beneath him wasn't frozen solid, and some dry wood had fallen off the nearby trees. Sam's hands were stiff as he gathered what he could find, carefully arranging the small pieces of wood inside the trench. The snow above had already begun to accumulate on the edges, but Sam had packed it tight enough that it wouldn't collapse in on him. He struck his flint and steel, the spark catching in the dry wood with a soft hiss. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the flame began to grow, curling upward with a slow, steady heat. Sam let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The fire would keep him warm for now. The heat, though slight, was a welcome relief from the sting of the wind. As the flames flickered and crackled, Sam settled back into the snow trench, his body still aching from the cold and exertion. He couldn't help but marvel at the simplicity of it all. A trench, snow, a fire. It was so simple, so elemental. Yet it was the difference between life and death out here in the mountains. Sam hadn't expected to be here. He hadn't planned for this. But that was the frontier, wasn't it? It didn't care about your plans or what you expected. The land gave you what it chose, and if you were lucky, it gave you the strength to survive it. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, his breath visible in the cold air. The fire was small, but it would keep him warm enough, for now. Sam let his eyes drift toward the mouth of the trench, where the snow continued to fall in thick, silent sheets. The storm had swallowed the landscape, and the mountains had gone quiet, once again. He was alone out here, but he wasn't finished yet. He would survive this. He had to. The first night in the trench was long. The snow fell harder now, blanketing the world outside in a layer of white. The wind continued to howl, but inside the trench, Sam could feel the warmth from the fire keeping the worst of the cold at bay. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even comfortable, but it was enough. Sam lay with his back pressed against the snow wall, his legs curled to conserve heat. The fire crackled softly in front of him, casting flickering shadows across the trench. It was strange how something as simple as a fire could feel like the only thing standing between life and death. He focused on it, watching the flames dance in the dark as if they were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world he knew. The cold was relentless, gnawing at his bones even as the fire burned. It was a sharp, biting cold, the kind that didn't let you forget it for a second. The wind would pick up from time to time, pushing the snow against the trench walls, and for a moment Sam would wonder if the snow would collapse and bury him alive. But then the fire would crackle, and the warmth would return, if only for a moment. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time Sam closed his eyes, he could hear the wind howling through the mountains, and he'd imagine what it would feel like if he stepped out into that storm. It was a death sentence. He knew that. The snow would swallow him up in an instant, and the storm would leave no trace behind. Sam had lived through worse storms in his time, but none like this one. This one felt different. It felt personal. The cold seemed to reach deep inside of him, testing his resolve, seeing if he was strong enough to survive it. It wasn't just about the elements anymore. It was about whether or not he could hold on long enough to make it through. The night dragged on. Sam's thoughts wandered, replaying moments from his past. He thought about his days on the trail, the cattle drives, and the people he'd known. He thought about the town he'd left behind, the saloon he hadn't been to in months, the faces he hadn't seen. All of it felt so far away now, like a distant memory. As the night wore on, Sam finally began to drift off, the exhaustion of the day catching up to him. His body ached, and the warmth from the fire made his eyes heavy. The storm outside raged on, but Sam found a moment of peace in the quiet of the trench, knowing that for now he had done everything he could to survive, and that, in this place, was enough. Sam awoke to the sound of the wind scraping against the snow trench, a relentless whistling shriek that pierced through the layers of snow above him. His body ached from the cold, but his fire still burned, a quiet, steady companion in the midst of the storm. The warmth from the flames was faint now, but it was enough to keep the freezing cold at bay. Sam could feel the sweat on his brow from the fire's heat, though it wasn't enough to stop the biting chill in the air. The storm had not let up. Snow piled higher outside the trench, the world reduced to a blur of white. Sam had to fight to push through the cold that gripped him, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. It was his survival, his life was at stake, and he couldn't afford to falter. The fire flickered weakly, the embers giving off little warmth. Sam knew he needed more wood, but the few logs he had gathered earlier were dwindling fast. He couldn't stay cooped up in this hole for much longer. He had to find a way to keep the fire alive, to stave off the gnawing cold that threatened to break him down. He peered out of the trench cautiously. The world was wrapped in a thick fog of snow, the wind whipping up drifts that seemed to swallow anything in their path. Sam could barely make out the shape of the trees beyond, their branches heavy with snow. There was no sign of any animals, no sign of life beyond the relentless storm. It would be foolish to venture out into the blizzard, but Sam knew he couldn't wait much longer. He needed wood, and the fire was running low. Without it, the trench wouldn't save him. He'd freeze before the storm let up. Sam's breath clouded in the frigid air as he sat up, his muscles stiff from the cold. The trench felt smaller now, the walls pressing in on him. He shifted his position, trying to get comfortable, but the chill was unbearable. His thoughts returned to the mountain trail, the cattle drives, the long hours in the saddle, the grueling months of work. The storm had stolen his warmth, had stolen his comfort, but it had not stolen his resolve. He would find a way out of this. He grabbed his knife and his pack, weighing his options. He didn't have much. There was no guarantee that the snow would let up any time soon, and if he stayed in the trench much longer, he'd run out of firewood completely. The fire would go out, and with it, any chance of warmth or survival. The cold began to gnaw at his legs and feet, his boots starting to feel like blocks of ice. Sam knew he had little time. He couldn't afford to wait for the storm to break. He had to make a move. After a deep breath, he climbed to his feet, prepared to venture into the storm. He steadied himself, determined to get the wood he needed and make it back to the trench before the cold swallowed him whole. Sam stepped out of the trench, the biting wind immediately assaulting his face. The snowstorm that had been raging all night had only worsened, its relentless fury blanketing the world around him. He could barely see more than a few feet ahead, the snow swirling in every direction, making it feel as though the world had shrunk down to nothing but whiteness. His breath came out in visible puffs, and every step he took felt like pushing through a wall of ice. The trench had been a temporary refuge, but with the fire burning low and the cold seeping into his bones, Sam knew he couldn't stay in the small, cramped space for much longer. He needed more wood. The fire had given him warmth, a faint, comforting warmth, but it wasn't enough to survive the next several nights. He had to keep it alive. Sam wrapped his coat tighter around him, his fingers already numb as he braced himself against the storm. He could feel the snow collecting on his shoulders, on his hat, on every part of him exposed to the storm. His muscles ached as he trudged forward, the snow crunching beneath his boots, each step heavier than the last. The wind cut through him like a blade, but Sam pressed on. The forest around him was barely visible. Trees were bent low under the weight of the snow, their branches heavy with ice. It looked like a landscape frozen in time, quiet and suffocating. Sam's eyes scanned the area, looking for any sign of firewood, anything to feed the small flame back in the trench. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Sam wasn't sure. Time seemed to stretch in the storm, each second blending into the next. The cold gnawed at him, but he kept moving, driven by the thought of the fire, the only thing keeping him alive. The world around him was reduced to shades of white and gray, the snow shifting and swirling with the wind, making it almost impossible to navigate. Just as he was starting to feel the weight of his exhaustion, his eyes caught sight of something. A small fallen tree lay not far ahead, its branches half buried in snow. Sam's heart raced. This was what he'd been looking for. He quickened his pace, his legs feeling stiff from the cold, but the thought of the fire kept him moving. He reached the tree and dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he began to gather the branches. The wood was wet, the snow and ice clinging to it, but it was better than nothing. He stuffed the branches into his pack as best as he could, praying that it would be enough to get the fire going again. With the wood secured, Sam began his slow trek back to the trench. His body was heavy, weighed down by the cold and the wet wood, but the promise of warmth kept him going. The storm showed no signs of easing, but he had what he needed to survive another night. As he reached the trench, Sam crawled back in, relief flooding over him as the warmth from the fire greeted him once more. The fire crackled brightly, its warmth fighting against the cold that still held the mountains in its grip. Sam sat hunched over, his back pressed against the snow walls of the trench, feeling the heat of the flames as they danced in front of him. He had managed to gather enough wood to keep the fire alive for now, but it wasn't enough. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting, and the night was still young. Sam knew the cold would return, and with it the gnawing hunger in his bones. The warmth from the fire was a fleeting comfort. It felt good for a moment, but it wasn't enough to push away the growing dread in the pit of his stomach. The storm outside had only gotten worse, the wind whipping through the trees and piling more snow against the trench. The landscape beyond the snow had vanished, buried beneath the weight of the storm, and Sam was left in a world of white, a prisoner of the weather. As he sat, watching the flames flicker, Sam's thoughts drifted to the cattle drives, the long days on horseback, and the long winters spent alone on the trail. The world had felt bigger then. There had always been a sense of freedom, the wide-open plains, the miles of land stretching endlessly before him. But now, here in the trench, the world felt like it had closed in on him. The mountains, the cold, the storm, it all felt suffocating, a reminder that in the wilderness, nature was in control. Sam ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his chin. He hadn't shaved in days, hadn't felt the need. The storm had made every other concern feel insignificant. Survival was the only thing that mattered. But even that seemed uncertain now. He had made it through the first night, but would he make it through the next? The fire had been his lifeline, But it wouldn't last forever. He knew that. The wind outside howled, louder now, and Sam pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. The cold wasn't just physical. It was mental, too, gnawing at him, digging into his thoughts. He had to keep the fire alive. But how? The wood he had gathered was enough for tonight, but would it be enough for tomorrow? Sam shifted in the trench, trying to get comfortable. His body ached, his muscles stiff from the cold, and the hours spent huddling in the small space. The fire crackled again, a welcome distraction, but the storm outside never stopped, and Sam knew that he couldn't stay here forever. He couldn't stay here alone, in this snow-covered trench, waiting for a storm to break. He had to get out. He had to survive. The fire was the only thing standing between him and the cold, but it wasn't enough. Sam closed his eyes, listening to the storm outside. He had made it this far, and he would make it through the night. The fire would keep him warm. For now, that was all that mattered. The storm raged on throughout the night, and by morning the snow had piled high against the trench. Sam lay awake, listening to the howling wind outside, the cold creeping deeper into his bones. The fire had burned low in the night, and though it had kept the worst of the chill away, the warmth it offered was now fading. Sam knew he needed more wood, but the task of venturing out again into the storm seemed almost impossible. The trench had been a lifeline, but now it felt like a trap, a confined space that was becoming harder to bear with each passing hour. The walls of snow around him felt as though they were closing in, the weight of the storm pressing down from every side. Sam's hands were numb from the cold, his legs stiff, but it wasn't the physical strain that troubled him the most. It was the isolation, the endless stretch of snow, the relentless storm that seemed to stretch on forever. He could feel the storm tightening its grip on him, and every moment in the trench seemed to make him more aware of how little control he had over his fate. The fire was the only thing standing between him and the cold, but even that was uncertain. How long could he keep the fire going? The logs were dwindling, and the snow outside showed no signs of easing. Sam had always prided himself on his ability to endure, but this was different. This wasn't just a test of physical strength, it was a test of will. The storm was an enemy he couldn't see, but he knew it was just as relentless and unforgiving as any man. Every gust of wind, every flurry of snow was a reminder of how small he was in this vast wilderness. He was at its mercy, and there was no escaping it. He glanced at the fire, still faintly flickering in the trench, and took a deep breath. The fire was all he had. It was the one thing that made the cold bearable, the one thing that kept him from surrendering to the storm's fury. He couldn't let it go out. He had to find more wood, even if it meant stepping into the storm again. With a grunt of effort, Sam pushed himself to his feet, the cold air biting at his skin as he stood. His body was sore from the constant tension, the fear that had settled in his chest. But he didn't have time to think about it. The fire would go out if he didn't do something. It was as simple as that. And without it, he would freeze. The snow was waist-deep now, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. Sam took a deep breath, bracing himself against the wind, and began to move. Every step felt like a battle, but he pushed through it. He had no choice. Sam knew that if he didn't find firewood, he might not survive the day. The storm was still there, still waiting, and he would have to face it head-on. Sam stumbled through the snow, his boots sinking deep with every step. The wind cut through him, sharper now, and the storm continued to rage, covering everything in a blanket of white. He barely saw anything ahead of him, his vision obscured by the swirling snow. But he didn't stop. There was no turning back. The fire in the trench was the only thing keeping him alive. Without it, the cold would creep in, and he would be lost in the vast expanse of snow and ice. Sam's breath came in short, sharp gasps, each exhale visible in the frigid air. His body felt numb, but he kept moving, forcing his frozen legs to carry him forward. His hands were stiff, his fingers raw from the cold. He could barely feel them anymore, but he held on tightly to the knife at his side. It was his only tool, the only thing that could help him survive out here in this unforgiving wilderness. The trees loomed ahead, their branches bent low under the weight of the snow. Sam pushed through the thick underbrush, his mind focused on the task at hand. He needed wood, he needed to keep the fire burning. The storm was his enemy, relentless and unforgiving. The cold was already seeping into his bones, and if he didn't find more fuel, he would be trapped here, unable to survive. Sam's thoughts drifted for a moment. He thought of the cattle drives, the long days spent in the saddle, and the nights spent under the stars. The world had seemed so wide then, full of endless possibilities. But now everything felt confined. The snow, the wind, the storm it had reduced everything to a single moment, a single goal: survival. He couldn't afford to stop. His body was tired, but he had to keep moving. The cold had a way of creeping in, and once it settled, it was almost impossible to shake off. Sam knew that better than anyone. He reached a fallen tree, its branches weighed down by snow. Sam knelt beside it, his hands shaking as he began to cut the wood. The knife was sharp, but it was harder to control with frozen fingers. Still, he pushed through, cutting the wood into manageable pieces. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for now. Enough to keep the fire alive for a little longer. With the wood secured, Sam stood and turned back toward the trench. The storm was still howling, and the wind seemed to be picking up speed. He knew it would only get worse from here. Every step felt heavier, the weight of the snow and the cold slowing him down. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not yet. As he trudged back through the snow, Sam focused on the fire, on the warmth it offered. It was the only thing that mattered now. If he could get back to the trench, if he could keep that fire alive, he might just survive this storm. The storm had weakened, but the damage had already been done. Sam sat in the trench, his body aching from the cold, his legs stiff and numb. The fire burned steadily in front of him, but it wasn't enough to chase away the exhaustion that weighed on him. The snow outside had piled high, and the world beyond the trench was a blur of white. Sam had survived the worst of it, but the ordeal was far from over. As he sat in the quiet, listening to the faint crackle of the fire, Sam's thoughts drifted to the time before the storm. The days on the cattle drives, the long hours spent in the saddle, the nights around campfires with friends and strangers alike. Those memories felt so distant now, like they belonged to someone else. The world had changed, and Sam had been forced to change with it. But the storm had passed, and the worst was over. Sam had made it through, and that in itself was something to be proud of. He had survived, not just by luck, but by his will, his knowledge of the land, and his ability to adapt. The fire in front of him was a testament to that. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him alive, enough to keep him going. Sam's eyes wandered to the horizon, where the first light of dawn was breaking through the storm clouds. The world outside was still buried in snow, but the sky was beginning to clear. The wind had slowed, and the snowflakes no longer danced in the air. The worst of the storm had passed, and now Sam could see the faint outlines of the mountains, their jagged peaks rising against the sky. For the first time in days, Sam allowed himself a moment of peace. He leaned back against the snow wall of the trench, feeling the warmth from the fire seep into his bones. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The cold was still there, lurking just beyond the warmth of the fire, but Sam had learned something. He had learned that survival wasn't just about enduring the elements. It was about holding on, no matter how hard it got. It was about finding a way through the storm, even when it seemed impossible. Sam closed his eyes for a moment, his mind drifting. He thought about the next steps, how he would continue on his journey, what lay ahead. He thought about the firewood he still had, the food he'd saved, the strength he had left. He knew there would be more storms, more challenges, but he was ready. The fire had kept him alive, and that was enough for now. He opened his eyes as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a soft glow across the snow-covered ground. The storm was over. Sam had made it through. And for the first time in days, he felt the weight of the wilderness lift, if only for a moment.